Greetings and welcome as we come now to the sixth Sunday of the year. And in fact, this will be the last Sunday before we begin the season of Lent. Also, I wear red today because this particular weekend, of course, is special in many people's lives and has to do with hearts. You know how that is. Anyway, the readings this time, the first reading comes from the book of Sirach, chapter 15, verses 15 through 20. Second reading is from 1 Corinthians, chapter 2, verses 6 through 10. And the gospel is from Matthew 5, chapter 5, verses 17 through 37. And we are going to look a little bit to see that because with the coming of a new season, the readings assigned for next time continue the readings that we hear this time in the gospel. So we will make some mention of it because verses 38 through 48 really complete the kind of teaching that is presented by Jesus here. So just a kind of little heads up on that. This time, of course, we are, we're told that about the commandments. And of course, by the time that we have adjusted to it, there are 10 commandments. Although certainly by the time, for example, that Jesus was teaching in his own time, the tradition had developed a lot more, of commandments, often expanding on the famous pattern that's set by the 10. The 10 commandments, as you remember, tend to regulate behavior. This was particularly behavior among the Israelites. This was, as we pointed out, somewhat different from other religious traditions, which did not engage much in that aspect of religion. Much more they were concerned with proper belief, worship, but moral aspects, well, yes, they were there. Certainly earlier on than the famous commandments attributed to Moses was Hammurabi's Code, which did set up, and when one compares his code to that of the Hebraic tradition, one sees considerable similarities. So it isn't to say that the ancients weren't moral, but it is to say that their religious tradition did not incorporate ways of acting as much into what was to be believed and the proper worship that was to be given. Now, what we'll find here, and just to kind of point out where we're going, Jesus is pictured not as abrogating, that is, doing away with the 10 commandments, but rather giving them a deeper sense. The word that is used particularly by many interpreters is fulfillment, that Jesus might be seen as giving them a deeper meaning or expanding on the way in which they could be and should be understood. The opening verse says that Jesus says, "You have heard that you have the law and the prophets." All right, so in the tradition, the first 5 books in the scripture were called the Torah, the law, and this was followed by a group of writings known as the prophets. By the time that Jesus comes on the scene and the Pharisees are on the scene, they have really already increased that understanding to be threefold: the law, the prophets, and the writings. All right? And so according to Matthew, Jesus is dealing with all aspects of the tradition. Law should be seen here, not so much in the legal sense that we use law today, you have broken the law, but rather the word for commandments are guidelines. That in other words, what God has pictured and had been pictured as giving to Moses and to the Israelites was a way in which they could be community. The importance of these laws, if you want, was to enable a strong and steady community, not only to be sustained, but also to move forward. And one of the kind of responses that Jesus will give now, and here we will hear, "You shall not murder, but I say," and that's the kind of phrase that is unique here, or tells us that there's something else that's at work here. The official interpreters, you remember, of the scripture were the scribes. The scribes because they were the group who could read and write. Now, we've mentioned this on a number of occasions, that people in the time of Jesus, ordinary people, often did not know how to read or write. Therefore, public laws were given vocally. In other words, someone who could read or someone who could speak in a proper way would give what the rules or laws were. That, of course, I smile a little because there are some young people today, as they are going through grammar school, who do not know how to read or write. So they may fall into the very category that was common in the ancient world. I'm sure that'll be rectified in certain ways in our time. But in those times, those who could read or write certainly also had a great power, because if you could read the law, you, of course, could be, at the same time that you were reading it, interpreting it. Perhaps there were some words in the law you didn't like or couldn't understand, and so you skipped them. See, so there always, of course, was the possibility of human frailty. But if the law was written, well, then you may not read it right, but nevertheless it stands correct because it was written. So when Matthew uses the phrase the scribes and the Pharisees, the idea of the Pharisees, and we have looked at this on a number of times, the Pharisees here would be the group who were living the Jewish life at the time that Matthew is composing his work. And we do suspect that Matthew is part of the community to which he is writing. It's also, and kind of reiterate this again, important to see that the group to whom Matthew is addressing his gospel were fellow Jews. At this time in the history of Christianity, the division between Christianity and Judaism was not firmly yet in place. So in other words, when we look at the community of Matthew, it is a community who were well versed and had grown up with and perhaps lived out the Jewish tradition. They had not given up Judaism to become Christian. That was not what was expected. So in other words, they happened to be members of the Hebraic family who believed in Jesus, who believed that he was the Messiah. Again, we reiterate that because this is important in appreciating sometimes the message that Matthew is presented with regard to Jesus. All right, so all of that again, a little bit of background. Now, Jesus, in a role of scribes, and it's interesting that perhaps Matthew sees Jesus having the ability to read or write. Now, we're not quite sure where or how he may have gotten that ability. Was it part of his family? Maybe. Was it the fact that, as we have mentioned on other occasions, he and his father did some work up in Sepphoris, that place which was about 4 miles from where he grew up, and that they needed, in order to be good carpenters, in order to get the work done that they were asked to do, the ability to read and write. Now, I don't mean that they were literary experts, but they had enough ability to be able to, kind of communicate in that manner. We're not quite sure, are we, just how Jesus acquired this skill. But in other places, he is pictured as when they hand him, for example, in Mark's story, Matthew picks that up. Jesus comes to Nazareth, he picks up the scroll, then he reads it, okay? All right, so that would indicate Jesus' ability to do this. Now, what Jesus does here in the section that we hear this time is reinterprets the commandments. Important to see, reinterpreting does not mean doing away with them, but that Jesus will offer to those who believe in him and accept his message a deeper appreciation or deeper understanding of things. So, for example, and I would suggest that this is one of the kind of qualities that is emphasized by Matthew's Jesus, is not to retaliate, not to strike back in the same way that you have been offended. And so let's listen to some of these. In other words, that Jesus offers an honorable way out of situations that could lead to feuds or death, okay? So where might we go? Well, let's take a couple of those examples just as a little beginning today. Thou shalt not murder. Now, by the way, it's often interpreted, thou shalt not kill. The translation there would be misleading, because certainly within the ancient world and throughout many generations, killing went on, okay? If you had wars, if you had other kinds of situations, killing happened. But murder, well, that's more particular to an individual. That requires a certain kind of thinking through a little bit why you are doing it and whether you will do it. And often, when one thinks of it, that murder is brought about by anger. And so Jesus kind of deepens a little bit the thought here with regard to murder, forbids anger and insults that could lead to murder. You think about it, and I hope that never happens to any of us, but if you get angry enough, we might say ticked off enough, that could lead one to do violent harm to someone else. See, so what Matthew sees Jesus as underpinning is the cause that leads to often wanting to take the life of someone else. And often, again, as we mentioned, in a retaliatory way. You have done something wrong to me. I'm not going to let you get away with it. And that's because, in some ways, honor was at stake here. If I don't retaliate, if I don't go back against someone who has done me harm, well, then how am I going to look? Kind of foolish, kind of weak, kind of dishonorable. And so this whole issue, as we continually notice throughout not only Matthew's story, but also throughout the New Testament, is the importance of honor. So what Jesus is pictured as saying, forbids anger. Don't become angry. Don't issue insults. And you will find that kind of slows down the need for causing harm to another. Now, some will say, well, you fool, if you don't do that, you're just looking kind of stupid and weak. Well, that, of course, is what Jesus is perhaps suggesting not that a strong taking a stance against, well, you harm me, but I'm not going to do the same to you, might require a great deal more courage than dishonor, or it might require much more stability than just to kind of go back after the person. All right? So, and the background again against this is the whole idea of family. If you do something harmful to one of my family members, and I don't do some action to go kind of get back, I'm kind of disowning my own manhood, and so I got to do something. I got to strike back. And Jesus says, wait a minute, let's consider an alternative here, okay? So, and in effect, what Jesus is going to be saying is, learn to live with your difficulty for the sake of family unity. Because when you kind of go violently against someone else, all that most likely does is open the door to that family saying, you did that to us, we're going to get back to you. And so the process of violence, of murder, just is perpetuated, just continues. There needs to be, maybe this is Matthew's point or Jesus' point that Matthew sees, a stopping of it. Look, enough is enough. How can we move forward in a more brotherly, family way? All right, so all of that lies behind the idea of murder. In fact, and this is why I will jump here to the section that we're not going to look at this time, but which would come up if we were celebrating a seventh Sunday of time, but we will not because of the beginning of the season of Lent this coming week, where Jesus pictures three ways that perhaps mitigate the need for retaliation. One is if someone strikes you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek. Now, we've looked at this before, but just to kind of quickly reiterate, it's a different way of doing it. If I strike you on the right cheek, I am assuming, of course, that you are right-handed like I am. The right hand is considered in the ancient world the hand of honor. Sorry, those of you who are left-handed. The left hand was considered to be the hand in which you use to, when you have the exterior of your body and you need to kind of cleanse it in some way, you get it, okay, was therefore considered to be a dirty hand, okay, and a hand of dishonor. So, got this, if I strike you with the right hand, you turn your cheek. If I'm going to strike you again, it's with the back of my hand. That is the dishonorable hand. Or I'm going to strike you with the left hand, which is certainly even worse. So what you have done is cautioned the one who struck you to do anything further. Maybe just, so you see, taking this stance is not that the one being struck doesn't do something, but rather is doing it in such a way that he or she does not perpetuate this kind of action. The second example that you would hear next time, and by the way, all of this is found in verses 38 through 48. If you are on your way to court because a debt is owed, wouldn't it be better to try to solve it before you get to the judge or to court? And if you did that, it might kind of ease the tensions that develop because of the debt that is owed. Because if you go to court, well, then the judgment is going to come that you will be sometimes imprisoned even until you have paid the last penny. And you do like the idea of the penny here, which even today, I know, although we're trying to do away with penny, was a very small coin, so coined by the Romans that it was considered to be almost worthless. But almost is not the same as total. And so until you kind of got to the last little bit of money, paid it back if you did not kind of solve and maybe find a way to end the problem before you got to court. So that's the second idea. And the third example that is brought in those verses 38 through 48 is that if someone makes you walk a mile carrying their cloak, and this was something that Roman soldiers could enforce on the lands that they occupied, rather than go 1 mile with them, walk a second mile. So in that way, whoa, the violence has been making you walk. Now you are, in fact, causing the person who imposed this rule upon you to think twice. Wait a minute, why is this person walking with me when they don't have to? Maybe I need to look at things a little differently. And there is the point. There's the point of these three examples that are brought in by Matthew. Look at things perhaps a little differently. All right. The other example that we will hear in verses 27 through 32, which we are looking at in our section here, is the advice against adultery and against divorce. We know, and it's important perhaps to keep this in mind, that adultery is less a result of passion and more an attempt to shame someone else. See, when adultery takes place, the one who is harmed, who is brought to dishonor, is the man. We're sorry, ladies, but we live in a patriarchal society here, and that in adultery, a man's property has been violated by another man. See, unfortunately, women are even considered in this action as property. They don't have any rights in it, what happens, but it's the way. And therefore, if you do this to my property, my woman, I'm going to get back at you. See, it's retaliation. We're back to the same point. So it's how does one avoid bringing shame if I commit an act against the wife of a man? I'm bringing shame to him, not shame to myself, but shame to him. How do you avoid that with him not wanting to retaliate in a way that would be harmful to him? Women, well, where do they fit into all of this, okay? But what might happen, just in case you're not, I'm not presenting this fully, because my property was hurt, my family is angry about this. So my brothers, other members of my family, maybe even my father, are shamed. And that's why the commandment had said that those who engaged in adultery should both be killed. Now, we're not really sure that in Jesus' time that rule, which is found in the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 22, verses 22 through 24, for those who want to check it, it advocates the death penalty of both partners, of the man and the woman. But again, men tended to find a way to get out of having to pay the price for here. So what can one do here to alleviate this? Well, forget adultery as a means of challenging other men. It's too devastating. Rather, could they not find some other way to achieve reconciliation? Easier said, one admits, but nevertheless, that is certainly where the teaching here goes. And then, of course, the question of divorce, which we have looked at other times, particularly in the Gospel, but even in Matthew. Divorce was something a man could do. And you remember that we noticed that there were perhaps already existing in the time of Jesus two schools of thought. One argued by a man named Shammai, who took a rather conservative viewpoint that divorce could only be for misconduct by a woman, okay? Hillel, who was also a progressive thinker in the first century world, argued that the reasons for divorce, Shammai said it had to be interaction physically against the partner, and that was the only reason. Hillel said, well, you could get a divorce for lesser reasons. So, for example, you burnt his supper. That might be enough for a divorce. All right? So we've talked about this before, but you can kind of see all of this is presented in this section. Don't do it back. It only continues it. And then 33 through 37 talk about lying. Now, we, of course, are encouraged not to lie. Keep in mind that lying in the ancient world was not considered so very terrible. And I'm afraid that some today don't think it's quite so terrible either, particularly publicly lying. So, in other words, what the teaching here is, be honest and direct, particularly, by the way, in economic issues. So this had to do with the marketplace. If you are offering something for sale there, you have to let the yes be yes and the no be no. Let's not lie about that. Because you see, and I know this is a very different ethic than we're perhaps accustomed to, lying was understood to be, well, all right if you could get away with it. Hence why the term hypocrite later will arise, because with the mask on you couldn't tell the truth of what one was doing. So in this little section, which follows as we had from the famous Beatitudes, from the issues last night, time of light and of salt, now comes to these topics. What are the topics that are talked about in this particular section of Matthew? Murder caused by anger, adultery caused by lust, divorce caused by oaths, and that's why, in a certain way, don't take an oath, because it generally involves some kind of lying. It's a little more confusing or complex, isn't it, than sometimes it appears. Also, if we're going to live the way that Jesus taught, we need to respond to evil. How? By loving friends and enemies. The Hebrew people were always encouraged to love friends, and enemies often were family members. You're supposed to love them regardless. Now, other enemies, obviously not families, would be much more difficult to love. What remains, and that is kind of the message here that is being developed by Matthew's Jesus, okay? What remains, and if you think about it, these issues remain important to discuss then as now. These are controversial matters, are they not? And easily answered, but not so easily accepted. Finally, so Jesus does not do away with the Torah, finally, as we come to an end here, but his community and he lived the Torah way, but wanted to be lived in a deeper and at least from some Christian viewpoints, much more radically. Finally, as we have noticed, Jesus says, you have heard it said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. We've looked at this before, but let me just conclude by saying, keep in mind that this rule was passed in order to kind of limit violence. So if indeed the Christian way is to avoid a violent response, at least in the tradition, there was a pattern that suggested a way to do it. An eye for an eye. If you take out one of my eyes, I can only take out one of yours. If you break one of my teeth, I can only take out one of your teeth. Proportionality. And maybe even today, there is some value to that. But all of this would be characterized, how's a nickel word in concluding, impermissible consanguinity. So how do we relate closely to others in such a way that we make them all brothers and sisters? Well, thank you for being with us. Love all.